Who are the U.S. and the British Commonwealth in prophecy today? These are arguably the biggest and most powerful empires of all time. And yet, as we approach the end time, there's no mention of them in the Bible, or at least so it seems. The Bible mentions many Gentile empires, such as the one in Daniel, and how they would be world-ruling empires. But yet, they have come and gone, and here we are, as we no doubt approach the end time. And the U.S., as well as the British Empire, the British Commonwealth, have come and are even starting to wane in terms of their power and influence. And we know that we are in the end times, and yet, how is it that the Bible has failed, in the eyes of many, to not mention these great powers in the end time? Did God not foresee this coming? Or is this just time and chance? Is this something that is just happening without God's intervention? You would think, though, with all the other mentions, that the U.S. and the British Commonwealth would be mentioned. And I'm here to tell you that they are indeed mentioned, just not under those names. But today we're going to begin a process, and it'll take us 2 times to go over this. But we're going to begin this process of putting prophecy and biblical history together, and we'll even throw in a little bit of secular history as well, but we try to look at what the Bible has to say, put the Bible together, to see that indeed that the U.S. and the British Commonwealth are indeed a major player and a major factor in end-time prophecies. Let's begin in Genesis, where we'll spend most of our time today. We're going to begin with a promise that God made to Abraham in Genesis 22, verses 16 through 18. Genesis 22, verses 16 through 18. We're going to begin with some immutable promises that God made to Abraham. And by that I mean that when God makes a promise, he is going to carry it out, especially if it's an unconditional promise, which is what he made to Abraham. Abraham was willing to sacrifice his only son, and God said, now I know, that you will always obey me, you always do what it is I want you to do. In verse 16 he said, by myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and not withheld your son, your only son. And you have to understand how old Abraham was at this time, and that his son Isaac was his only son, by him and Sarah, and that if he killed him, here he is at this great old age, wondering, okay, how then, would I start over? But he had the faith that either God could start over, or that he could even resurrect Isaac if need be. Verse 17, then he pronounces the blessing. Blessing, I will bless you, and multiplying, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heavens, and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So because of this willingness that Abraham had to sacrifice his only son, God made this unconditional covenant with Abraham. He said, I will bless you and your descendants. So again, it was probably evident to Abraham at that time that it wouldn't necessarily be directly from his loins, but he had his son Isaac. And we know how the story goes, and Isaac had Jacob, and Jacob had 12 sons. So you can see that the promise was beginning to be fulfilled. But not only that, but he said, you're going to have many descendants, not just a few, and they will possess the gate of their enemies, this access way, the access paths to other nations. Often we've talked about these different types of sea gates that nations have that allow access and trade and gives them a certain amount of power as well. He's saying that I'm going to give those to you of your enemies. These are the people, obviously, that hate them. And they will possess them and own them and control them. And these promises that God is making here are unbreakable. God is going to do what he committed to do. Now, moving on, we see later on in chapter 26, if you want to turn there, that these promises are then reiterated and passed on and, as it were, verified or re-verified. And we see this sequence of it passing from Abraham then to Isaac. Notice in chapter 26, verses 3 through 5. Dwell in this land, and I will be with you, bless you, for to you and your descendants I give all these lands, and I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. So again, he's just restating it for fact. And I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give to your descendants all the lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall bless. So notice as we go along also, as parts of these physical promises that are being made to Abraham and reiterated to Isaac, we're following a chain of custody, as it were, but also there's little things that continue to be added that we can use as descriptors of what or how to identify these people or these promises being fulfilled in the future. So they'll not only own the gates of the enemies, and they'll multiply as the stars of the heavens, but in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. So because of these people, these descendants of Abraham, the people of the world will be blessed because of them. And then he ends it in verse 5 by saying, because Abraham obeyed my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. And this is why, again, part and parcel of the blessings went hand in hand with this obedience, the obedience of Abraham, and, as I said, these immutable promises that God made to Abraham. Now, next chapter, chapter 27, verse 26, we see that it then goes on to Jacob. Chapter 27, verses 26 through 29. Then his father Isaac said to him, come near now and kiss me, my son. And he came near and kissed him, and he smelled the smell of his clothing and blessed him and said, surely the smell of my son is like the smell of a field which the Lord has blessed. And of course, we know about the deceit here of Jacob in trying to steal this from Esau. But verse 28 says, therefore, may God give you of the dew of heaven, of the fatness of the earth, and the plenty of grain and wine. Let peoples serve you, and nations bow down to you. Be master over your brethren, and let your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be those who bless you. So once again, it's elaborated a little bit more now to Jacob, where he's saying, okay, you get the fatness of the earth. The land is going to yield abundantly for you. Plenty of grain, plenty of wine. People will serve you. Again, these are all indicators. Nations bow down to you, and you will be master over your own people, over your own brothers, as it were. And even your mother's sons shall bow down to you. Again, let me iterate that these are physical blessings that are being promised here. And that's what we're highlighting at this point. Chapter 28, verse 13, again, it shows how this is going to be and have a worldwide influence in verse 13 through 15. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham, your father, the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your descendants, and your descendants shall be as dust of the earth. So again, multitudinous. You shall spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And in you and in your seed all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So again, you see that even if they are in still a specific point, that they will go out from there to the world. And this people, upon whom this blessing will come, will be able and will spread around the world. Verse 15, behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go. God is going to continue to be involved in the process, wherever they are, and will bring you back to this land. Again, he's talking about at the second coming of Christ, because again, as we follow this through, we'll see that after the captivity, that it did not happen, that the nation of Israel did not come back to Jerusalem as a whole. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. And then chapter 35, it's again promised to Jacob again. Chapter 35, verses 10 and 11. Again, getting to some even more crucial points that help us discern who these people are in the future. It says, and God said to him, your name is Jacob. Your name shall not be called Jacob anymore, but Israel shall be your name. So he called his name Israel. So he went from Jacob, which meant supplanter, which he was named at birth because of the events and because of prophecy. And then it was changed to Israel, which more or less means prevailer with God after his struggle with Christ and the dislocation of his hip. But the point here is that, okay, Jacob becomes Israel. So Israelites are the ones who came from the man Israel. His 12 sons became the Israelites. Right? So again, we see that name now appear. Verse 11, interesting, he says this to Jacob, to now Israel. Also God said to him, I am God Almighty, be fruitful and multiply, which we've seen several times now. A nation and a company of nations shall proceed from you, and kings shall come from your body. So again, we see this, and this is, I think, a very interesting way to put it, and he's very distinct, and we'll see this actually come up again. But he says, not only a nation, but a company of nations. Again, this is promised to Jacob in chapter 35. Now, this is obviously, again, a lot of these things are prophetic, and it shows what Israel will look like in the future, because again, we're following sequentially this prophecy, this process of the promise from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, who's Israel. Now, one of the things we need to realize is that the Jews are not Israel. Okay? Israel consists of Jews, right? Do we know where the name Jew comes from? It's from the tribe of Judah, right? Judah was just one of the 12 tribes. In fact, I think he was the fourth, was he? If anybody knows. I think he was the fourth son, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, of Jacob. So he was merely one, and we need to keep this in mind, that the Jews came from Judah, the tribe of Judah, one single tribe of the Israelites. And this will become more important as we talk about it. And also, when we look at this promise as well, okay, well, let me just say this about the Jews too, why I bring it up. This is a side note too, and I cover this because people say some of these things that this applies to the Jews, that these blessings will go to them as a nation and a company of nations. Well, the Jews have never been a company of nations. Okay? Israel as a whole was a nation composed of tribes, but they were never referred to as individual nations in that way. So it does not apply to the Jews, and it does not apply to the church either. The promise cannot apply to the church because the church is one. The church has always been one, composed of many people, whoever have God's Holy Spirit. Plus, in all of this, we're talking about physical promises. That's why we're focusing on this and not the spiritual aspect of the blessings, even though we'll touch on that just a little bit. This is a physical promise, and it was made unconditionally, without condition. So it came from father to son without earning it, right? This is what the birthright's about. It goes from father to the oldest son. Now it goes to the oldest son unless the oldest son disqualifies himself or God intervenes supernaturally. So just as in the case of Jacob and Esau, Esau was the oldest, but it was promised to, and God even told Rebekah at the beginning, that Jacob would be the one to receive it. Now, Jacob didn't need to go and be deceitful like he was, and it caused problems down the road, but nonetheless, Esau rejected it and disrespected his birthright, and it was given to Jacob. So what we have is a single nation, a commonwealth of nations, multitudinous people, and they'll possess the gates of their enemies. Now notice what else in chapter 27, verse 26 through 29. Then his father Isaac said to him, "Come near now and kiss me, my son. Therefore may God give you of the dew of heaven, of the fatness of earth, the plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you, and nations bow down, and be master over your brethren. Let your mother's sons bow down to you." Okay? So again, that has to be added to, which we read before, added to these promises of the birthright. Now, as we search for Israel now, okay, who the blessings went through, we need to follow this birthright trail and continue to follow it. Like we said, normally it goes from father to son, but in the case of disqualification, it then can and does go to somebody else. So who was then Jacob, or Israel's firstborn? His oldest son was Reuben. Let's go to chapter 35 and verse 22 of Genesis. And legally, according to the law or the custom of primogeniture, which is the fancy name of birthright from to the oldest son, the birthright should have gone to Reuben, but he was disqualified. Notice what he did here. Chapter 35, verse 22. And it happened when Israel dwelt in the land that Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, one of his father's concubines. And Israel heard about it. All right, so they all knew that this happened. Again, it wasn't at that point that many of them, and there was 12. Now the sons of Jacob were 12 at that point, and they were starting to have their own kids. But Reuben went and did this, and it disqualified him from being the one that the birthright passed to. In fact, you don't have to take my word for it, but let's turn over to 1 Chronicles 5, verses 1 and 2, and notice, and we'll notice something else there as well. 1 Chronicles 5, verses 1 and 2. First Chronicles 5, verses 1 and 2. Now the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, meaning Jacob, he was indeed the firstborn, but because he defiled his father's bed by sleeping with Bilhah, the concubine, his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph. So now we see the next step. The son of Israel, so that the genealogy is not listed according to the birthright. Yet Judah prevailed over his brothers, and from him came a ruler, although the birthright was Joseph's. So there's this distinction that is given right here. That, okay, it doesn't go to Reuben. It says that Judah did earn something because he was prevailing, as the term is, over his brothers. And so he had a certain portion of the promises, not the birthright, but certain other promises that were made. But the birthright went to Joseph. So Joseph was the 11th born. He's the firstborn of Rachel, right? The one that Jacob wanted to marry in the first place. But he got fooled and got Leah. And then he got back, and Rachel was barren for a while, so he went to Bilhah and Zilhah. And then finally Rachel bore Joseph. So we see here, again in 1 Chronicles, that he gets that birthright, but as we call it, the scepter went to Judah. That is, the spiritual promises and the kingly promises went through the line of Judah. But the birthright, the physical blessings, went through Joseph. Again, we need to make that distinction, and I want to be clear that we're not talking about the spiritual seed. We're not talking about the fact that Christ would come from the lineage of Judah, okay, and all the promises that went with that. We're talking specifically, and we're being very specific because the subject can get out of control very quickly, and the fact that I'm going to try to do it in two, I'm going to try to do it without talking too fast along the way. So now, we see that the birthright went to Joseph's sons. Who? I can remember still reading about his sons, and these names come out like out of the middle of nowhere. Because we know Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Typically, everybody knows Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The forefathers. And then, a lot of people, more people maybe know Joseph because of his colorful story or his colorful coat. There's a Broadway play named after it. So they kind of know about Joseph, from a superficial point of view. But it's to his sons. Who in the world are his sons? They are Manasseh and Ephraim. Let's look at this in Genesis 48, verses 1 through 6 to begin with. And we see that indeed this birthright was passed to Joseph through his two sons. So when you talk about Joseph, he had two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and it was to them, because Joseph had been sold into slavery by his brothers and spent all this time in Egypt for a purpose, and that was to save the house of Israel during this time of famine that was to come. Plus, there were other reasons, obviously. But during that time, he had two sons. Now it came to pass after these things, Joseph was told, "Indeed, your father is sick." And he took with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Now, in the Bible, you always do it in the order, right? He says Manasseh and Ephraim, the writer here at this point says this. Keep that in mind. Jacob was told, because Manasseh was the older, we'll see that. And so they said Manasseh first. So Jacob was old. And he said, was told, "Look, your son Joseph is coming to you." He didn't know. He couldn't see that well. And Israel strengthened himself and sat up on the bed. Then Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. And he said to me, Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you. I will make of you a multitude of people and give this land to your descendants after you as an everlasting possession. And now your two sons." And notice what he says here. Notice what Jacob says under inspiration. Ephraim and Manasseh. He switches the order up. He would not have done that normally, except for the fact that, as we'll see as we go through this chapter and even the next, he is prophesying. He is doing these things under inspiration of God. And again, this plays a part. I don't make this lightly, because it plays a significant portion of what we're going to come to here shortly. So I take your two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. As Reuben and Simeon, they shall be mine. So again, he's making a point here that even though Joseph was over in the land of Egypt and married an Egyptian wife, and they'd been estranged for this long, he's making it very clear that I consider them, and I am making them, and there may even be an intimation of a legality even here, that they are my sons. So they are his sons. As Joseph was his son, now he's saying, these are my sons. So then he continues In verse 6, your offspring whom you beget after them shall be yours. They will be called by the name of their brothers in their inheritance. So we see God's hand is in this. Look at verse 10. Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, so that he could not see. So when they came to him, he couldn't see them, didn't know. But he said, Ephraim and Manasseh. And then Joseph brought them near to him, and he kissed them and embraced them. Verse 12. So Joseph brought them from beside his knees, and he bowed down with his face to the earth. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim in his right hand. Okay, understand this. He puts Ephraim in his right hand toward Israel's left hand. So they're facing Jacob or Israel. He's looking at him this way. So he's lining up Ephraim, the younger one, with the less dominant hand of Israel for the blessing. Okay, so the blessings typically come from the right hand. But this is the dual nature of this blessing was that it was going to have to be two hands. So it's the right hand. I think we're familiar with that term. It's even in the New Testament. Who's going to sit at your right hand? The predominant hand. So back to the scripture in verse 13. And Manasseh with his left hand he put towards Israel's right and brought them near. So he brings them up, right? The older one, Manasseh, towards Jacob's right hand. All right, and the other towards the other. Now remember, Jacob can't see. He's dim, he's probably blind at this point. And he stretches out his hand, verse 14, he stretches out his right hand and crosses over and lays it on Ephraim, the younger one, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, guiding his hands knowingly, for Manasseh was the firstborn. So he purposefully crossed his hands at this point. And again, he didn't know these kids, really. He didn't grow up with them. They were off in this foreign land. Jacob thought that Joseph was dead all this time. And now as he comes to the end of his life, he says, bring them to me. I have a blessing to pronounce upon them. And notice what part of that blessing was in verse 16. The angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads. Again, a reference to Christ. Let my name, which is Israel, be named upon them. So he now is conferring the birthright blessings, his name, Israel, upon Ephraim and Manasseh jointly. And the name of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, let them grow into a multitude into the midst of the earth. So do we see what's happening here? That it's a prophetic, not only is it prophetic in terms of the fact that God was guiding him, but that he's saying in the future, these two peoples will be Israel. This is who Israel is now. This is who the birthright goes to. It does not go to Reuben. It does not go to Simeon, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Issachar, or any of the others. It goes to Joseph, to his two sons, with the right hand, the greater, more prominent blessing upon Ephraim, and then the other on Manasseh. This is a key to prophecy. So in the future, in the Bible, in the future, when it talks about Israel, it's talking about the descendants of these two people, of Ephraim and Manasseh. It is not talking about the Jews. People confuse the fact that Jews now reside in a state called Israel. That is not the nation of Israel. The Jews comprise only one of the tribes of Israel. Israel, as referred to in the Bible, are the descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh. And again, you might be saying, who? Again, that's why we're here today. We're talking about this. Let's continue in verse 17. Now when Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him. So he took hold of his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. Again, he's thinking that maybe maybe Jacob, Israel here, is confused. And Joseph said to his father, "Not so, my father, for this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head." But his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people. He also shall be great. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations." Do we see that now? The promises made back to Israel in chapter 35, verse 10, 11. Now, here we are, it's being conferred upon Ephraim and Manasseh, saying that Ephraim is going to become a multitude of nations, but also at the same time it says that Manasseh shall be great also. So again, we see this physical birthright being passed on through this blessing, this laying on of hands of Ephraim and Manasseh by Israel and the crossing of the hands. So he blessed them that day, saying, "By you Israel will bless, saying, may God make you as Ephraim and Manasseh." I mean, that's how great. Everybody's going to say, man, if we could only be like Ephraim and Manasseh. Thus, he set Ephraim before Manasseh. So, we have now the conferring of this birthright onto them. Now, I might also hasten to add at this point, too, that during those times, Ephraim and Manasseh never became this great nation or multitude of nations during that time, during this time that we're talking about right here. And even when they went into, again, captivity into Egypt, and then after captivity, it wasn't until much later that this happened. So now continuing in chapter 49, Jacob continues to prophesy. Again, we can see even more directly in verse 1 that this is a prophesying that God is leading him. Again, there's no chapter breaks in the original manuscript. So this is just a continuation of what was being said in chapter 48. And so Jacob called all his sons together and says, "Gather together that I may tell you what shall befall you in the last days." So here we have this prophecy that these people, these sons of Israel, the Israelites, would indeed continue to exist in the time of the last days. And he's telling them right now, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen to you in the last days. All right. So if you want to, you can go through and look at what's going to happen to everyone. But specifically, let's look at Judah and Joseph at this point. In verse 8 of chapter 49, it says, "Judah, you are he whom your brothers shall praise. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's children shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He bows down, he lies down as a lion. And as a lion, who shall rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah." All right, so this is part of the prophecy, that the prophesying and the things that we were talking about over in Chronicles. But the scepter, that part of the promises, would follow through Judah, or the Jews. And again, the Jews we know are in Israel today. And again, this is still largely true today. Who's going to rouse Jerusalem? You know, who really wants to have the wrath of the Israelis, the Jews of the Israelis? You know, they'll come at you fierce, and, you know, whether it's like the 6-day war or whatever, they have the ability to do it even now. Now, continuing in verse 10, it says, "Nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh," another name for Messiah, "comes." So again, this was always going to be a part of it. And again, this is the prophecy of Jacob. But now, skip down to verse 22, and he continues then. He says, "Joseph." Now, Joseph is, Ephraim and Manasseh, is a fruitful bough by a well. His branches run over the wall. What does that mean? His branches run over the wall. the wall is typically your borders of your city. And yet here we have the offshoots of him that are going to run over the wall. They're going to be, in other words, a colonizing type of people. And they're going to go out from there and establish even more areas, more people, colonize different areas. Verse 25, by the God of your father who will help you, by the Almighty who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that lies beneath, blessings of the breast and of the womb, the blessings of your father have excelled the blessings of my ancestors. Up to the utmost bound of the everlasting hills, they shall be on the head of Joseph, and then to his sons, and on the crown of the head of him who was separate from his brothers. So again, we see a pronouncement again of this bountiful blessings that are going to be heaped upon Joseph and his two sons and Israel throughout this time. So now let's skip ahead. So here we are. Joseph was in Egypt. He was number 2 to Pharaoh. But then another Pharaoh took over and did not know Joseph. And the people of the Israelites, the Hebrews, went into slavery for centuries. And then they came out. All right. Then they wandered in the desert for 40 years. And they made it to the promised land finally. And they're there. And God is leading them. He is their king. He's their lawgiver. He's the one that's guiding and directing them. And what do they say after getting to the promised land? Give us another king, like the peoples around us. And so, Samuel said, what am I going to do? And God says, don't worry, Samuel. They haven't rejected you. They've rejected me. So God gave them a king. And Saul became that first king. And Saul rejected God, basically. And then Saul's son, his sole survivor, Ishbosheth, was on the throne. And he was on the throne for about 2 years. And then that was it. Saul's lineage was completely cut off. And David was put on the throne. Now let's look at 1 Chronicles 29 and verse 23. And what we're going to see here is God making more promises, everlasting promises, to David and his descendants that we need to take note of as we now follow this birthright blessing to come to our final conclusion down the road. 1 Chronicles 29:23, it says, then Solomon sat on the throne of the Lord as king instead of David his father, and prospered, and all Israel obeyed him. So again, a couple things there, right? Is that it is the throne of the Lord. Okay, it was God's throne. All right? He's allowing David to sit up on it. And then, after David, because David sat on it, then Solomon sat on it. Now let's turn back to 2 Samuel 23 and verse 1 and 5. 2 Samuel 23, 1 and 5. We're establishing first off that it was the throne of the Lord, that David sat on it, then Solomon. So 2 Samuel 23, verse 1 and 5. Now these are the last words of David. Thus says David, the son of Jesse. Thus says the man raised up on high, the anointed of God, of Jacob, the sweet psalmist of Israel. Verse 5. Although my house is not so with God, yet he has made with me an everlasting covenant. Okay, what's a covenant? A covenant's an agreement. And God made it with him, and it was everlasting. Okay, ordered in all things and secure. For this is all my salvation, all my desire. Will he not make it increase? Now, let's go back to 2 Samuel 7. We'll put all these things together in a second. 2 Samuel 7, verse 4. We'll read 4 and 5 and 12 through 16. I'll put that in your notes. 2 Samuel 4 and 5. But it happened that night that the word of the Lord came to Nathan, saying, "Go and tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, would you build a house for me to dwell in?" And then, skipping down to verse 12, "When your days are fulfilled, and you rest with your fathers," meaning he dies, "I will set up your seed after you," meaning Solomon, "who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name," meaning the tabernacle. "I will establish," or the temple, "I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, he shall be my son." Now note this, "If he commits iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men, and with the blows of the son of men. But my mercy shall not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne," okay, get this, "your throne shall be established forever." So what we're seeing here is that David's throne was established with Solomon, David's son, right, through Bathsheba. The throne, this was David's throne, was established forever in him, in Solomon. But what happens, though, if Solomon disobeys, which he actually ended up doing, like Saul did? Because the kingdom was wrenched from the hands of Saul, and his lineage was cut off completely because he fell away, among other things. But what happens if that happens to Solomon? He says, it does not matter. He says, "I will have mercy. I will bring about a method of chastisement," most in particular from other nations. "And even if they do disobey, I will not break this everlasting covenant with them." So it's a perpetual covenant. God will not take the throne away from David, who is now, David's from the king of Israel, from the line of Judah, right? But he is the king of Israel as a whole. He's the king of Israel. Again, the blessings are going through Israel, right? So now we come to the rub, right? If God says that this is always going to go through Israel, and that he's going to perpetually have somebody from David to be on this throne, what has happened? Because shortly after David, I say shortly in the span of time, right? The nation of Israel split into two. The northern half became apostate, and the southern half, being mostly Judah, remained, quote unquote, godly. The northern part went into captivity, as you recall. They were captured by the Assyrians around 721 BC. Okay? Again, it's important to keep this in mind. And as we move around, we'll try to, keep it straightforward here. Israel went into captivity for a cause. Because, again, they fell away from God. They went after false gods. They broke the Sabbath and idolatry. They were taken by Assyria out of the land of Canaan, out of modern-day Israel, into Assyria, where they never returned from, back to Jerusalem. Again, that's another key to understanding prophecy, is the fact that the northern part, which was called Israel, went off into captivity and never came back to Jerusalem. So whenever the Bible talks about saying, I will bring Israel back to Jerusalem, he's not talking about out of Assyria, because we know from history that they never did come back. So any prophecy that's talking about that is talking about a future prophecy about Israel, whoever that may be. And we're getting to that, right? Now, here's the thing, is that they never came back. Judah continued for about another 130 years afterwards. And they then went into captivity. Let's look at this in Jeremiah 39, verses 1 through 7. Jeremiah 39, verses 1 through 7. Now we're coming to Judah going into captivity. So here we are, the last king sitting on the throne of David. And it's Judah's going into captivity. Okay, we'll have to see what we can do about reconciling that. But let's begin Jeremiah 31, verses 1 through 7. Now we come to Zedekiah, who was the last king of Judah. And notice what happens to him. In the 9th year of Zedekiah, king of Judah, in the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army came against Jerusalem and besieged it. In the 11th year of Zedekiah, in the 4th month, 9th day, the city was penetrated. And then all the princes of the king of Babylon came in and sat in the middle gate, and it goes through their names there, with the rest of the princes of the king of Babylon. So it was, when Zedekiah, the king of Judah, and all the men of war saw them, that they fled and went out of the city by night by way of the king's garden, by the gate between the two walls, and he went out by way of the plain. But the Chaldean army pursued them and overtook Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, in the plains of Jericho. And when they captured him, they brought him up to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, to Riblah in the hand of Hamath, where he pronounced judgment on him. Then the king of Babylon killed the sons of Zedekiah, his descendants, his lineage, before his eyes in Riblah. The king of Babylon also killed all the nobles of Judah. So this is anybody else who might have a right to the throne. Moreover, he put out Zedekiah's eyes. So this was the last thing that Zedekiah saw. His last memory, his last visual memory. It was his sons being killed and the nobles all being killed. Then he put out Zedekiah's eyes and bound him with bronze fetters to carry him off to Babylon. And then skip over to chapter 52 and verse 11. Jeremiah 52:11. He also put out the eyes of Zedekiah, so picking up the story. And the king of Babylon bound him in bronze fetters, took him to Babylon, and put him in prison till the day of his death. So Zedekiah remained in prison in Babylon until he died. So what are we to glean from this passing section? One is that all of Zedekiah's sons were killed, as well as any potential heirs, any possible heirs to the throne. Then, after he put out Zedekiah's eyes, he was taken to Babylon and he died in prison. So there's no, mistaking, him actually going back and having set up things. So then we're presented with another problem then, because if God made these promises that, first off, these blessings would come on Israel, and that David would also have somebody always on his throne, then we have one of two things. Either God kept his promises and did these things, or the Bible is false. That God cannot keep his promises, that God does lie, that these things do fail, that these things don't come to pass. So then, where did the throne go to? You're going to have to stay tuned till next week to find out.